I welcome representatives of SBS. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witness and evidence has been provided to you. We have your submission. Would you need to make any changes, amendments, or to your submission?
No, we wouldn't send it.
Okay. So, Mr. Coyle, would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, please. That'd be great. Thank you, Chairman. SBS welcomes the opportunity to further discuss the proposed changes to the SBS Act with this committee. The SBS submission contains all of the information that we believe is important to help senators to make informed decisions on the way they vote on this legislation. However, I would like to take this particular opportunity to reiterate a few key points, and I think they're important for the general discussion that's been occurring this morning. At the outset, can I just reaffirm that SBS supports this legislative amendment which will actually help us to maintain our current levels of investment in content in an environment where government funding for public broadcasting is being significantly cut. As the committee is aware, SBS's funding was cut by $53.7 million over 5 years following an independently led efficiency review of the ABC and SBS last year, the Lewis Review, in which it was broadly acknowledged that due to SBS's prudent efforts to find efficiencies, there were few options left to achieve savings outside of core services. Hence, $28.5 million of that cut was predicated on successful legislative amendment. If I could just quote the Minister from his speech on 19th of November 2014 when he announced the cuts to the public broadcasters, and I quote from Minister Turnbull, "I should acknowledge that the SBS has always been a leader in doing more with less, in no small part because it has never had much money to play around with. When we restructured the bankrupt 10 network more than 20 years ago, we learned a great deal from SBS's lean operating model, and it is still in many respects a good example today." The reality is that without passage of this legislation, SBS is unable to fully deliver on these savings measures, which has been already cut from our forward estimates, and we would find ourselves in a very, very difficult financial position. I'm conscious there's been a lot of discussion around the impact of this change, not only today, but obviously for the last couple of months on the commercial sector, and the impact on the commercial sector, I should say, and the essence of SBS's and the unique role we play, and I'm sure we will cover many of these questions in the coming minutes. However, I would like to highlight just a couple of things, key things. Firstly, the Charter, and people have talked about the Charter a lot today and previously, is at the heart of SBS. The Charter says the principal function of SBS, if I'm quoting here, paraphrasing, is that we provide multicultural and multilingual content to inform, educate and entertain all Australians and promote a multicultural society. That remains at the heart of SBS's mission, and what we do is all about that. We've drawn a portion of our funding from commercial revenue now for 25 years. We started doing effectively becoming a hybrid organisation in 1991 with the first small levels of advertising beginning in March 1992. And we have a workplace culture, operating systems and codes of practice and guidelines in place to manage the complexities of being a public broadcaster with commercial activities, whilst maintaining the integrity of the SBS Charter, and we've been doing that effectively for 25 years. Distinct from our commercial broadcaster counterparts, any revenue raised through advertising and sponsorship goes directly to enabling the organisation to protect our content and services. So I want to dispel this notion that, and we can talk about this in questions later, that somehow any additional minutes in advertising is somehow going to be a real threat on our charter, because we've been doing this for 25 years and we know how to do it. Secondly, SBS's 120 minutes a day daily cap on advertising, which is well below the 350 minutes per day the commercial broadcasters can devote to advertising, and our 13-14 revenues made up less than 2% of the $3.8 billion commercial free-to-air broadcasting revenue that people have been discussing today. This bill clearly does not seek to provide more minutes to SBS. We're staying at the 120 minutes per day, per 24-hour period, and we're not seeking that. However, what we do need is the ability to be flexible enough in how we average those 120 minutes across a schedule to give us the opportunity to make incremental revenue gains where it is practicable and appropriate. We've done extensive modelling to reflect the financial impact of this legislation and estimate it would allow us to earn an additional $28.5 million in net revenue over 4 years. Suggestions that this incremental increase would adversely impact the commercial television sector are dramatically overstated. The estimated incremental gross revenue that SBS expects to earn represents less than 0.3% of the total forecast free-to-air television market in each year. That's $3.8 billion. We are fully confident in the modelling that we have undertaken to assess the impact of this legislation, and that modelling has been verified independently by Deloitte and OMD, two well-established firms. The primary concern for SBS in considering the proposed legislative changes, of course, our audience. This year we celebrate 40 years since we were brought into inception, and we're extremely proud of the insights and links we've built with Australia's diverse multicultural communities, and their loyalty is not something that we take for granted. We know that any change to our advertising arrangements will impact audiences, and to that end, we've sought to further understand their views and opinions. We recently conducted research with over 1,100 people, and the overwhelming number of respondents, 73%, have said that they would prefer SBS to offer the same amount of unique and distinctive Australian programs and services funded by slightly more advertising in some time slots and offset by less advertising in other slots that maintain the status quo and rather than risk losing programs and services, which is the question that we asked. We know our audiences better than anyone, and should this legislation pass, we are very well placed to manage the changes sensitively with our audiences and naturally. It's in our very best interest to ensure that we maintain the unique loyalty of Australians for SBS. I also note and thank the Federation of Ethnic Community Councils of Australia, FECA, an organisation representing many of the communities which our charter specifically aims to serve, and they've made a submission as well outlining some very similar sentiments to the majority opinion found within our audience research. To conclude, we've already undertaken major wholesale back-of-house initiatives to absorb government funding cuts, and without this change, SBS would be unable to protect current programming and service levels, which would invariably impact on our ability to deliver on the charter. The legislative amendment enables SBS to increase its reliance on commercial revenues to protect current levels of investment in Australian programs and services, whilst planning for the future to ensure our business model is viable and our already modest resources can be directed towards successful programming and service initiatives. And finally, in dispelling this idea that the commercial networks are subsidising the government cuts, as I mentioned, we've been doing this since 1992, and we've been competing as a hybrid organisation within the commercial sector since 1992. That's 25 years, almost 25 years. We're not increasing the 120 minutes. We're simply seeing in this amendment ability to have flexibility to actually use some of the minutes in different time slots during that 24-hour period across the schedule. And that flexibility is critically important for us to continue to provide the services that we provide that meet the charter obligations that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just touch on the discrepancy between the estimation and the figures that we've received from free-to-air and the figures that you are quoting in terms of potential revenue gains by this particular initiative? I know you probably can't go into too much detail for some of the commercial reasons, but there's been some debate about the fill rate that SBS is able to achieve. We're talking about 80%, 70%. I mean, are you in a position to be able to give us some sort of understanding about what your fill rate is across metropolitan and country?
Thanks, Senator. I mean, there's two parts to that question. The first one I'll endeavour to answer about the inconsistencies, and I think that before we get into fill rates, we can hand over to our Director of Sales and Advertising. Just this point about inconsistencies between the various projections in the Lewis Review and the regulatory impact statement. The Lewis Review contained an element that wasn't contained within the legislative package that's before us. And it really spoke in terms of gross revenue as well. And we're talking about net revenue in my opening statement. At the time of the Lewis Review, the actual legislation being proposed by the government was not entirely clear. In fact, as far as we're aware, the legislation was drafted approximately 6 months after the completion of the Lewis Review. So they were quite different in that respect. As far as why we can't share some of those projections, it is true that it does contain confidential commercial information that would disadvantage SBS if it were to be released for public scrutiny. However, we have made it available to both the Department of Communications so that they could verify our assumptions and approach, and as I mentioned earlier, to Deloitte and OMD, I think, as part of that referral process. On the question of fill rates, I think it might be better to hand over to our Director of Sales and Advertising, Andrew Cook.
Yeah.
Sure.
That modelling, are you able to provide that to the committee on a confidential basis?
I think on an in-camera basis or a confidential basis, that might be possible, yes.
We'd be happy to. That would be great if we could have that. Thank you.
I think it's fair to say that we do know our business better than anyone else. It's also fair to say that we've had two experts verify our numbers, both Deloitte and also the CEO of one of Australia's largest ad agencies, OMD, Mr. Peter Horgan. The fluctuations are from a number of differences, from both from things like audience growth rates. That obviously affects what you sell and how you sell it. The fill rates, which I can get to a little bit more in a moment. Also the rates with which you sell those spots against, and the potential in discounting. And also and most importantly the charter and what SBS stands for, and the fact that we don't do things like Big Brother, we don't do things like My Kitchen Rules. So the charter does restrict our revenue making opportunities. When it does come to fill rates though, currently SBS is not 100% full. So as a result of that being the case, you have fluctuations in the revenues that you are putting forward because the starting point is incorrect.
Yes, you're only full at 90%. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you put another 5 minutes in there, ain't going to fill it. Yeah.
Correct.
That comes to the point of there was a concern expressed by the witnesses earlier that if SBS was able to put 10 minutes in, the 6 to midnight period, plus your ability to also do, self-promo, which obviously everyone has the capacity to do, that it would look and feel the same as another commercial station. My sense from what you've been saying and in your submission is that that's not the case. This is targeting at specific things, the capacity to put 10 minutes into the World Cup or 10 minutes into a very popular cooking show. I just would be interested in your experience. How do you think the look and feel of SBS would change under this regime?
Before I hand over to Andrew, just a general answer to that. I think, firstly, it would be unrealistic to assume that you're going to fill every minute in that 10 minutes, every hour of every day for the next 4 years. That's certainly the case. The way the ad market works is much more complex than that. And I think the questions earlier that we would discuss were around promotional minutes and so on. We do some of that, obviously. It's important for us to hold audience for the next program. We have to promote our own programming. But I guess the feel, if you're asking about the feel of it, I would dispute the fact that this would be the same as the commercials. It's still lower than the commercials. As I said, the total figures are they've got their own voluntary cap of 350 minutes per 24-hour period. That's their target, I guess, or their cap that they've imposed upon themselves. We're still at 120 minutes, so there's quite a bit of difference there in that regard. And even if you're looking at that prime time period, we would still be advertising minutes much lower than the commercial networks, which can go up to, as I think someone said, 13 or 14 minutes in that hour period. Andrew, did you want to add to that?
Just as a small thing, when you watch on SBS, say for instance sport, if there's some sort of injury time, you'll often see you guys just sit there and watch the stretch come onto the ground, etc., etc. Whereas obviously on the free to air they have the capacity because of their additional time that they can actually go to an ad break at a time when there's nothing actually occurring. I mean, is that the kind of thing that you'd be looking to do to assist you in sort of having a less boring presentation of you?
Actually, given the nature of football, soccer, we're talking about, it's actually some of the agreements or arrangements with FIFA, for example, mean that I'm not sure exactly, don't quote me on this, but that you can't actually advertise during that, even if there is an injury break. There are certain arrangements there that you couldn't even do that because of the nature of that sport, so you're almost limited to doing it at half-time or before the game or after the game. But, I mean, if there were different types of sport that we had, which apart from football, that might be a possibility, yes.
So I suppose, is there any assistance in sports programming as an example by these changes?
There is some small assistance, yes.
Okay. Just in terms of, you being a hybrid model, I asked some people, some of the witnesses earlier about their experience of, has anybody done any research to see how other hybrid models around the world operate in this space for public broadcasters? And just have you got any idea for the kind of quantum of public broadcasters around the world that are a hybrid model as opposed to the pure ABC style model?
Well, in fact, to answer that question directly, the majority of public broadcasters are a hybrid model. I think the exceptions to that rule are effectively the ABC in Australia and the BBC, which are different models. But if you look at Channel 4 in the UK, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Dutch public broadcaster, there's the TV New Zealand, which also is in that group, the Spanish RTVE, Ireland RTE, and also the Austrian, for example. They're all examples of hybrid models that work quite successfully.
Okay. And do we have any comparison in terms of times and figures and things that you could? I mean, not now, but I'd just be interested in the comparisons.
Well, off the top of my head, I could tell you that some of them, such as they're in the submission. James is pointing that out to me. We've got a list of them in the appendix in the submission. But off the top of my head, for example, Channel 4, I think has the same caps as the commercial networks in the UK.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Senator Urquhart.
Thanks very much. Given that the Prime Minister said that there wouldn't be any cuts to SBS prior to the election, when did you find out that there would be cuts to SBS through this regulatory change to advertising?
Oh, that's a good question, Sen. I'm not sure of the exact date, but we were informed by the government, by the Minister's office, that there would be these cuts following that whole process of the Lewis Review and the Tony Shepherd Commission of Audit.
But you can't remember when?
Not the exact date. I'd have to take that on notice
and come back to you.
Because it might have been relayed directly to our Managing Director at some point.
If you can just take that on notice and let us know, thanks. So if those changes hadn't been made, so if there had been no cuts to SBS, which was what was promised, would you still be advocating for these sorts of changes?
I would actually say, Senator, that these flexibility arrangements would be something that we would support, regardless of whether the cuts were made or not.
So you would have still been proposing to change the advertising?
We didn't propose, but certainly we go through many different ways to try and find additional revenue for SBS, whether it be increasing government funding, which didn't happen, it went back the other way, right through to ideas such as this.
So you didn't suggest that this was a proposal that SBS would be interested in?
Not that I'm aware. There were discussions about all the different possible ways to increase our revenue so we can continue to provide those content and services, and some of those discussions may have happened with the government or previous governments. I'm sure that all of these things are always discussed as part of an ongoing process with government to try and find efficiencies and find better ways of doing things. So whether they were actually, was something that we directly proposed or whether it was part of a discussion, I'm not aware.
Well, are you able to take that on notice and give us some more specific details? Because we did hear earlier evidence that this sort of proposal was put to government by SBS. So. Yeah,
I wouldn't characterise it like that. It may have been part of a discussion around what are the ways that we can find additional revenues given the constraints around government funding. I would say this in a general sense too. I mean, we have also said quite publicly, our Managing Director has said it publicly in Senate estimates on a number of occasions. I've said it at Senate estimates as well. If a federal government of whatever political stripe or persuasion decides to fund us for the commercial revenue that we currently have, then that'd be great. It's a decision for the government, future government, to decide to have us cease our commercial activities, but then provide us the offset of whatever that revenue might be. We don't necessarily see any particular coalition or Labor government making that decision anytime soon. So we have to find ways to continue to be efficient and to find ways to have revenue. And with this particular example that we're talking about today, it really is one in which we're not increasing the minutes. It's still 120, but we're looking at flexibility, our own flexibility to actually make the arrangements during the course of the schedule.
But you're having to do that because there's cuts being announced to SBS.
They've been tied to those cuts. That's certainly the case. And as I said in the opening statement, the revenue is predicated on a legislative amendment. Your question was whether outside of those cuts, whether this would be an idea. That would be a discussion that we would be having with government. They may have proposed it outside of the cuts. It didn't happen that way. It's counterfactual, counter-historical, I guess.
Well, I'd be interested if you'd take that question on notice and come back. So the Minister has stated that the bill will bring in the total savings return to the budget to $53.7 million. Has the Minister asked you to model what a reduction of $53 million would mean to your organisation?
We constantly go through, or have gone through, all of our contingency planning around these particular cuts, and we've done a lot of work in that space. We do have our CFO here today. You're happy to hand over to him to talk about the amount of work that's gone into trying to find efficiencies and savings. I should add before he goes on that we have been doing this for a while, always finding better ways to do things and to be more lean as far as our operating model.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I would think that any business would do that. But my question was, did the Minister ask you to model what that reduction of $53 million would look like to your organisation? That's the question.
I don't recall being asked directly. I'm Director of Corporate Affairs, so I don't know if there was a question.
Maybe Mr. Taylor can assist.
I think in the process of understanding the impact of the funding cuts, Senator, we've been able to identify clearly that we can find, of the 53.7, the breakup, as I'm sure you're aware, is approximately 28.5 in commercial revenue over the forward estimates and 25.2 in back-of-house efficiencies. We've been able to demonstrate that we can accommodate just the 25.2 from back-of-house efficiencies, things like improved procurement initiatives, outsourcing certain functions to the market, like our broadcast operations function, which we just recently outsourced to a commercial provider, finding efficiencies in transmission and distribution. And through initiatives like that and a range of much smaller initiatives, we're able to fund about $25 million of the cuts. The remainder could only be funded through either an increase in the amendment to increase flexibility in our ad legislation, or through further cuts, which unfortunately would come from content areas.
And I would add, Senator, too, that we are a public broadcaster that gets around $283 million in federal funding. The ABC, I think, is just over $1 billion. We were already quite lean in our operating model. We were already quite efficient. We'd already outsourced quite a bit for the back office functions.
Not a lot of areas.
Not a lot left, and the team did a pretty good job in even finding further efficiencies for that 25 million.
Which is why I guess you would have been happy that there was going to be no cuts.
Correct.
Okay. Just one last question. We heard comments earlier from varying witnesses about the fact that, the increase in prime time ads, what that means to viewers. Have you done any surveying or questioning of your viewers as to what you expect will be their reaction in terms of increase that? Because I think what we're hearing is that, that we've got a pie that's so big, there's now a competition for, who gets a piece of that pie. The pie's going to get, or the pieces of the pie are going to get smaller to each of the organisations. How do you think the SBS viewers will deal with that?
Two parts to that question. First, let me address the second part, the pie. People have been talking a bit about this pie. We've talked about $3.8 billion for commercial advertising for television, I should say, but a much larger total Australian advertising market of around $13.2 billion, and I get that figure from the PwC Media Outlook. It's around $13 billion. And the structural challenges that all of us have been talking about with regard to a lot of that advertising moving away from free-to-air television advertising to these other mediums. And that's certainly a challenge that we're facing as much as the other commercial broadcasters, in part because we are, as I've said for 25 years, have been a hybrid model where we also have commercial revenue that we gain as well, and we're competing in that same space. The pie itself, though, is $3.8 billion for TV and $13 for the total, and our share of that is quite minuscule. We're talking about 0.1% of the total Australian advertising market, and the increases that we'd get out of this particular amendment would represent that, a very tiny fraction of that, and certainly with the television advertising market it probably is around 0.3%. So again, a very, very small figure. And to answer your first part of the question, we did do some survey work and research. In fact, we had a research done to over 1,100 participants, the majority of which were SBS viewers, and that's an important point because I think some of the previous research that was put forward by Save Our SBS, at least the 2008 survey, one of the questions showed that I think only 54% were actual SBS viewers, so that did distort some of the answers there. But our audience, that's part of our audience research panel, and we go out to SBS viewers, and of those 1,100 that were questioned, around 1,000, I think, were SBS viewers, and about 73% of those, when faced with a question which was, would you accept additional minutes in the prime time period to maintain the status quo so that we can continue to provide our content and services, or not have this amendment, which would mean cuts to those content and services, which is the reality, 73% said they would be satisfied or happy with continuing the status quo, I should say, with those additional minutes in prime time, because they were making a choice, I guess, a decision, I guess, between, well, if we don't have those additional minutes, it could mean that we lose those services, that content, and we'd prefer to keep that content. So that's the offset there. So that research was quite thorough, and we can share that with you.
So when was that done?
When did you say, Senator? I think it was recent. It was probably about. I would have to come back to you. I'll take that on notice. It was very recent. It was March or April this year.
Yeah. So after everybody knew that the SBS would be cut.
Yes, that's right.
So you could pretty much answer the question yourself without doing a survey.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks for your evidence thus far. I might just ask a quick follow-up to where Senator Urquhart was. Did your survey ask whether what your audience felt about the government cuts in the first place, or was that just taken as a given?
I don't have the questions in front of me, Senator, from the survey. I'm happy to. I think we do. If we haven't put it in as part of the submission, we're happy to share it with some of the results and the questions.
It's trouble you a bit that a full quarter of your audience opposes increasing advertising, even according to the way that you'd constructed your poll, even if it meant that programming would be affected?
Well, I think you would agree, Senator. I know you've been a champion of the public broadcasters in the past, and particularly of SBS, and your position has been clear that it'd be preferable not to have any advertising at all, and that's understandable that a potential percentage of the audience and the Australian public would probably share the view.
No, nobody likes advertising. It's like a tax. It's just the cost of having a commercial free-to-air broadcaster. Nobody likes the stuff.
And we've said, Senator, that, and you've heard me say it, and our Managing Director, if a federal government's willing to give us the offset, the commercial revenue that we've been gaining for 25 years, we wouldn't do it.
Have you put that argument to them? It appears from the outside, I'm not part of your management meetings, obviously, that you just gave up without a fight. In fact, some are even saying, previous witnesses have said it may even have been the station's idea.
I wouldn't say, I wouldn't characterise it like that at all. In fact, what we're fighting for and what we're keeping as the guiding star for us, the compass, if you like, and following that, is to protect our charter and to protect our content and services. If the government decides to cease commercial activities for SBS, there's a choice for the government. It's a decision for the government, and we will work with that. The government's cutting us. We'll have to work with that and find the savings and efficiencies. But sorry, you asked me a question about the charter.
Yeah, it wasn't a question. I'll try and phrase it as a question. It's probably a bit fairer. How do you see the inherent tension in chasing advertising revenue, which means you need to chase a much more populist audience, a larger audience, which takes you completely in the opposite direction to which you're bound by your charter?
I'm really glad you asked me that question, Senator Loveland, because there is a notion out there. There is a notion.
I don't think so.
I don't think it was Dorothy Dixon.
It really wasn't.
It wasn't. I'm really glad you asked me that question, because there is a notion out there that SBS is chasing advertising revenue and dollar, and that would have a causal impact in the sense that it would mean more populist programming or programming that's not charter-based. Now, let me clear this up for you, because when you look at programming which we would agree would be very much in the charter, go back to where you came from, Once Upon a Time in Cabramatta, for example, some of our tentpole programming, the connection, i.e. audience doesn't ratings don't always equal more commerciality and more advertising. I mean, people have talked about Struggle Street recently. Actually, we didn't make any money on that, even though the ratings went through the roof because of the publicity around it from the Mayor of Blacktown. Advertisers make decisions about what they advertise on. So we're driving or commissioning content that is charter-based, knowing full well it might not necessarily make the money. So unlike the commercial networks where they're driving The Voice or MasterChef or whatever it might be, simply to monetise that, to get the return on investment that they're putting in, our content is driving charter obligation
And we know full well that that doesn't always mean we get a return on it. In fact, sometimes it doesn't. Go Back didn't, I don't think, made that money. I'll let Andrew clarify the numbers, or the general numbers. Some of it's commercial in confidence. But the point I'm making is that this idea that advertising leads to more populist content, or content that's viewed by large audiences or the Australian public, certainly mean necessarily more advertising, is not correct. And if you look at all of our big programming like Go Back or Once Upon a Time Cabramatta, which is very much charter driven, that wasn't making money for us. We did it because we got a big audience, not because we were getting money out of it necessarily.
Right.
That's a byproduct of it.
And you're fortunate to still be in receipt of significant taxpayer funds as a public broadcaster, but the point being, the further down the commercial path you travel, the less room you're going to have to be able to do that. I would have thought just by definition that's the case.
Again, I would disagree with that characterisation.
We
because
withdraw all your public funding and just force you to be a fourth commercial free-to-air broadcaster.
Well, I'm not sure
you're
if the government's planning that.
No, it wasn't a proposal. It was a hypothetical.
Oh, right.
That you're then completely at the whims of the market.
Well, I can't comment on what the government's plans on. I know what's before us now, which is not an increase in advertising minutes over a 24-hour period, but an ability to be flexible about those minutes in that 24-hour period.
Yeah.
That's what's before us.
That might mean that there'll be a little bit less advertising at 4 o'clock in the morning. You're going to be shunting stuff into the prime time slots where most of the eyeballs are. That's how commercial broadcasting works.
Well, the basis, I guess, of the flexibility would allow us, rather than doing some minutes at 4 in the morning, with the exception of the Tour de France if it's on, you put some of those minutes in prime time.
Right. So most of your audience is going to notice an increase in advertising.
There'll be a noticeable increase in advertising.
And
However,
your advertiser are going to want to know that people are watching at the time that their ads are going to air, and that will change the nature of the programming that you commission.
Again, you're making an assumption that it changes the nature of the program.
We just heard 4 people in the business of commercial broadcasting saying that that's how they operate and that that's how you will be operating.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Senator. That's how the commercial broadcasters operate. SBS has a charter, which is our mandate. We get $283 million from the federal government to fulfil that charter. Now, most of the time we get it right with our programming. Sometimes we don't. But the notion that the advertising that we do somehow drives our decisions on that on the charter content is incorrect. In fact, if it was correct, you're flying in the face of a history of the last 20 years where we can't even fill, as Andrew has said, most of the minutes that we have, right? Because we are driving with charter content. We know that charter content can actually get big audience, but it doesn't necessarily mean advertising. So I want to make sure that the committee understands that there is this disconnect. It's not as simple as more advertising means more populist content. That's not the case. In fact, when we commission big things like Go Back to Where You Came From, we're not going for the money on this because we know we could be doing something far more populist, which would fill the minutes that we have. That's not the case.
What kind of programming will you need to commission to sell that ad space? Because it seems to me that the pitch that you're making to the committee is going to be totally different to the pitch that your advertising, your marketing people are going to be making.
We are not going to be making commissioning decisions based on the minutes. We never have and never will. The minutes are simply a flexibility to allow us to add some minutes, if we can fill them, on the charter commission content.
But you are predicting, otherwise this would be a complete waste of everyone's time, millions of additional dollars worth of ad revenues coming in to fix up this gap that the government quite cynically has opened up in your finances. So you are predicting, millions of dollars, tens of millions over the forward estimates, increases in ad revenue. So where's that going to come from if you're, running this entirely charter-based, anti-commercial sounding line?
Well, again, it's not. Charter-based content is not necessarily anti-commercial, nor is it driven by commercial imperatives. I think what I'm trying to explain is that when we commission content, or in fact acquire content, we're doing it with the eye on our charter obligations, which is what we should be doing. If it does sell advertising, that's part of that process, but we're not making the decisions, unlike the commercial broadcasters, which sit down probably and think, let's do The Voice or whatever it might be so we can get the biggest aggregate audience, so we can get the most advertising dollar. We want audience because audience equals relevance for us as a public broadcaster. But sometimes large audience doesn't necessarily translate into advertising dollar because some advertisers are not interested in that type of program. And there's the difference. I know it's a bit more nuanced and complex than advertising means commerciality. It doesn't quite work that way. And I can assure you that the commissioning decisions and the content decisions, the acquisition decisions within SBS are not being driven by 5 minutes of advertising or 10 minutes of advertising, frankly. They're being driven by what it is that we're supposed to be doing as part of our obligations as a taxpayer-funded organisation. If those programs we can have some advertising minutes around them, we do so, because that helps us bring in more revenue to do the very content that what I've been trying to explain is important for us.
I suspect that too, that the commercial team don't have any responsibility around programming or scheduling of the shows, and the minutes or the scheduling of additional minutes is more around flexibility than anything else, and providing us with the potential flexibility to have additional advertising on any shows that might appear to be of more interest to advertisers than others. Free TV earlier mentioned the fact that Struggle Street had huge audiences. I can absolutely say with authority that the threefold increase in audiences that we saw on an average night of say when Struggle Street wasn't on compared to when it was on, we didn't see a threefold increase in ad revenues as a result of those huge audiences. If anything, we saw a decline in the revenues.
How would you describe as morale inside that broadcaster at the moment? Staff
Within SBS?
Yeah.
I think people at SBS, this comes out in a lot of our employee surveys, people love working at SBS because there's something that they're doing which has a purpose. And the purpose is something that people really believe in. They believe in multiculturalism. They believe in SBS's role in having Australia be a successful migrant country and a successful multicultural society. So unlike a workplace, not to denigrate it, but a workplace which is entirely driven by the bottom line, there is a purpose at SBS which goes beyond and above that, and people do believe in that, and people love working at SBS for that reason.
Some of your staff quite clearly believe that purpose is being grievously undermined by initiatives such as this that management appears to have embraced. There's an increasing frequency of leaks in the media around the decisions to turn the time slot just before the 7 p.m. turnover in your news broadcast into stuff that's light and fluffy, so people don't turn over to the ABC, or to what happened to Dateline, or I could cite a reasonable number of instances where actually it seems people inside the broadcaster are quite concerned about the direction that you're going in.
Senator, I'm not sure if we have the time for me to go back and counter all of the assertions you've just made there, because there are answers for each of them. But I will make the general statement that yes, there have been some leaks. They happen from time to time in any organisation. Some people are disgruntled. That happens in any organisation. But I could tell you that for the vast majority of SBS employees, the fact that they work at SBS, that they fulfil part of an important mission for Australia's national interest and our multicultural society, that the levels of morale are very, very good. On the matters the individual matters, I don't agree with the way you've characterised them, but I don't think we have the time for me to go through each of them.
All right. I've got two more quick ones, and one you can take on notice if you like.
Sure.
How much funding did you get for rolling NITV in with the broadcaster, and how does that compare with how much you are spending on NITV? Is it 1 for 1?
Well, when NITV joined SBS, I think it was around $15 million. Is that right, James? It's about $15 million. And we'll take it on notice. We'll get back to the exact figure. It was 15 or 16. That has been maintained, but also in addition to that, in the last 3 years, we have provided, or the general network in totality has provided all manner of support for NITV, which has offset what other costs they would have had to put in place. And I want to make, and I'll let James in a moment talk about the numbers, but I want to make a point about NITV because, again, you may be implying with your question, the fact that...
I'm actually genuinely interested. Okay. I don't know what your
internal NITV, like. If I can just say this about NITV, it's certainly not a commercial endeavour, but it's important for Australians to be able to see Indigenous content, and 80% of NITV staff are Indigenous. We promote that and encourage that. When I first started at SBS 3 years ago, we pushed very hard to take NITV out to remote and regional areas of Australia so that the Indigenous production sector and the Indigenous community leaders could get a face-to-face and understand what NITV is going to be providing for their communities and for the production sector as well. So that I was very clear, I didn't want it to be a Sydney-centric focused organisation. We had to be out in other parts of Australia. We have, all of us in the executive, have worked tirelessly to try and help build up NITV to the success that it is today. Still got a lot of work to do, obviously, but we've provided them with all sorts of back office support, whether it be corporate affairs, marketing, sales, and so on, so that NITV doesn't have to pay for this, because it's part of SBS now, so we provide them with that support. So there's a lot of strong support internally.
I wanted to leave some time for other senators to put questions to you. So if you've got any or more you want to put to us on notice around how it's structured, that'd be great.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Xenophon.
Mr. Clewell, I can just make it very clear to all of you, I don't support the cuts to the SBS. I think they're quite repugnant, and from my perspective, I'd like to see a way of finding savings elsewhere so that those cuts don't take place. So that's just want to put that on the record. But in relation to this proposal, isn't it the case that you're not able to you're not able to sell your existing minutes? Is that right?
Well, no, that's not the case. We do sell some existing minutes.
No, but you still have an excess capacity in terms of the current constraints.
Yes.
During prime time.
Well, did you want me to hand over to you, Andrew, to explain that?
Well, that is correct. We aren't 100% full.
We're not 100% full.
You're not 100%
and I think it was claimed earlier that we were 100% full. We're not.
No, but if you're not 100% full now, and you'll be adding to that capacity extra minutes during prime time, how do you expect to fill that if you're not 100% full now? I mean, presumably you'll be reducing your rates, won't you?
Well, it comes back to flexibility, Senator. We are not 100% full across our prime time schedule. There are some shows where we have quite huge demand, where we would like the flexibility to add minutes.
Right.
Existing programming.
Right.
So again, I understand a lot of them has left the room, but sort of making sure that we're not talking about us driving some new sort of populist content to fill these extra minutes. We've already got demand, strong demand for existing content, whether it be our food programming or other content that we have.
But insofar as there will be a greater reliance on advertising revenue, you must at least consider whether a program would attract advertising revenue or not.
No,
I mean, Struggle Street apparently did not attract revenue. Is that right?
Again, let me explain to you, Senator. So if we were to, as Andrew was saying, if there are some programs existing programs where we already have very high demand and we are filling up to 100%, that existing program could provide us with a couple of additional minutes of revenue, of advertising revenue. Okay, that's not content that's going to be created solely to get those additional minutes. It already exists. Okay. It's already charter-based.
Because we're over time, I just want to throw three or four more questions at you, as long as you understand the context of which I'm coming from on this. In terms of the report that was done by Deloitte and OMD, you'll consider providing those to the committee in camera, correct?
Did we agree earlier with the request?
I think you did agree, yeah.
I think they're actually attached to the
They're
submission,
attached.
Senator.
They're already attached. I think you asked, Senator, for
Provide those.
you asked for our modelling, which we're prepared to provide.
Yeah.
And the Deloitte and the OMD reports are already
but the modelling's not attached. The modelling's not attached.
The modelling's not. We'll
The
provide
modelling's
the
not attached, so that might be useful in relation to that. All right, that's fine. Can I just ask, in terms of with Freeview, you'll be saving $500,000 because you're pulling out of Freeview?
Yep.
Is an SBS cutting off its nose to spite its face, because that's quite an effective platform to get access to? I mean, I can understand why you're upset, but aren't you also depriving potential viewers, to get access to your content via the Freeview platform?
Again, Senator, the premise of your question is inaccurate.
Help me out here.
I'll explain it to you.
Please
I'm very happy to explain the Freeview process to you. The reason that we departed Freeview was not because we were upset. It actually had nothing to do with that. That's a separate matter. And I'll tell you what actually happened.
It's just a coincidence?
For a couple of years now, and I'm a board member on Freeview, it's been made quite clear that, and I'd made the point, and it's in the minutes if they're publicly available, that I think that given our relative size and our market share, that rather than paying a 17.5% shareholding of Freeview like 7, 9 and 10, that we should be around the same level of 6% as the regional members because of our size. That didn't happen. We were faced, obviously, with these cuts, 53 million in cuts. We have to make choices about cutting content and services. Freeview, like many other memberships...
How much does that cost you?
Excuse me?
How much does that cost you? How much does Freeview cost? Is about $500,000 a year? Or?
Around that. A bit more. In fact, the recent budget put forward $630,000. And frankly, I'd made the point in several Freeview board meetings that we were unable to meet those increases. We just don't have that kind of money.
So
and on the question of the services?
Yeah. I've only got one more question. I'm worried about time. Sorry, Chair, one more question.
On the question of the services,
Thanks.
we will still have our SBS app on IPTV-enabled televisions and so on, and we are in discussions too with Freeview about rejoining.
Right. Okay. Sorry about. I apologise for time constraints, but well, okay, you're going to save 500,000 or 600,000 in respect to that. How much does SBS pay for satellite retransmission fees on Foxtel each year?
We do pay a fee. I think it's commercially. Is it commercially in confidence as well?
Yeah, I suspect we take that question on notice.
We'll come back to you, Sarah.
If I suggested to you it was several $million a year, would I be in the ballpark?
I think it's less than that, but I'll have to take it on notice.
Well, it depends what you define as several. Is it 2 or 3 or 4 or $5 million?
It's something between 0 and several. I'll take it on notice. I'd rather not in reference to
You're being very helpful, Mr. Taylor.
I'm very happy to take it on notice.
Well, let's assume it's several $1 million, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4. Surely it would be commercial in confidence. That would be in your budget bottom line, wouldn't it?
I'm pretty sure we don't separate out in our statements, Senator. I suspect it is a commercial arrangement between us and the carrier, which is in this case Optus.
It has to provide us access to the Foxtel.
Right.
EBG,
but are you getting good value for money out of that? You're getting out of Freeview because it's not giving you value for money. You're getting value for money out of the retransmission arrangement with Foxtel.
Foxtel has 33% of Australian households, or thereabouts, and all the free-to-airs are on there, and that's a significant slice of the Australian viewing public.
But most people...
Whereas Freeview, we're talking about...
No, it's fine. I understand it, but can I just ask, I'm not suggesting you should or not, but what percentage of those households that have Foxtel also have an antenna so that they can get free-to-air anyway?
What we're talking about...
Do we know that? Is that something that's publicly available?
In
other words, if you didn't do the deal with Foxtel, would you lose 30% of Australian households, or would a significant proportion of those households have an antenna?
Well, I don't know the figures on that, Senator. I can only speculate that people who have Foxtel at home have 7, 9, 10, ABC and SBS on the Foxtel. So they watch it. So you'd have to get out of Foxtel and then go to your HDMI or whatever and then find SBS. It's a bit of a struggle. We do have a lot of true believers. They might go through that process, but...
I think you've got lots of true believers out there. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator.
Senator Sinodina, take your time.
Thank you. It's great to follow a true believer. Look, just very quickly, a couple of things. When you look at your audience, the demographics of your audience, how do they compare with the commercial part of the market? Is there a significant overlap?
There is some overlap, Senator. There obviously we have different demographics depending on the programming as well and the content. So some programming, documentaries might get an over 55 audience far more than a SBS2 sort of program that's pitched more at a younger audience. So it just depends and it varies from on the content.
The reason I'm asking is one of the points Free TV have made is that there is a similarity in audiences, particularly when looking at the 25, 54-year-old demographic, which tends to be a fairly important one from an advertising perspective. Is there a lot of overlap there?
There is some, as I said, depending on the programming. I think our audience demographics too go a bit older, skew a bit older.
Is it possible for you on notice to provide some information on that?
Sure, absolutely.
In a comparative way?
Yep.
And you mentioned before there would be programs in peak hour where if you had more advertising flexibility, you could fill the advertising time. Is that right?
Potentially, yes. I mean, as Andrew said, there's already high demand for some programming, and some of those minutes are filled 100%. So because it's existing programming, there might be potential to have an additional couple of minutes around that.
What sort of programs are we talking about?
Well, again, existing content that we have, it's hard to measure, but there's food programming that we have that's very popular. Some of our programming around the cultural elements of food and the travelogue element too as well, of exploring different live sports, the other one. So there'll be a couple that have already got some demand, and the additional minutes would probably come through on those.
But sport would be a big area from your point of view.
It'd probably be the number one.
It's fair to say that some of our sport isn't in prime time either. So if you look at the Giro, for example, it's on at the moment, or the Tour de France, usually the World Cup as an example as well.
The Tour de France is on at the moment, isn't it?
No, the Giro's on at the moment.
The
Tour de France starts
right.
starts shortly in July.
And
and that's late night programming.
Yes, that's a bit different. It's not even prime time. But
That's right.
But you'll get an audience for that sort of thing because of the nature of the program.
Yeah.
And there will be flexibility for you to potentially do more in that.
Yeah, so in some respects we could take minutes away from prime time to put in at 3 a.m. because people are watching Tour de France. I don't want to do Andrew's job. I'm sure you'll do it the way you do it, but that could be a possibility.
Sure. And when you mentioned before that programs like Struggle Street got big audiences, 1.3 million, I think was mentioned, that maybe it was the Monday night or the opening night, but you didn't necessarily get an increase in advertising revenue? How does that work?
If you look at the environment with which an advertiser is offered, the environment of Struggle Street and what it portrayed isn't of interest to a wide range of advertisers. They prefer to stay away from, let's call it, controversial content at times. Advertisers like to stay fairly safe in their environments, and as a result, there wasn't a huge amount of interest in staying within Struggle Street.
So when you're thinking about how you attract more advertisers, I mean, that last statement implies that to some extent you'd have to try and cater to more mainstream tastes and not be as edgy.
No, not at all. I'd like to make it really clear that the advertising team have absolutely no say in the content that goes on SBS at all. There is an independent programming team who look at acquiring and obviously making television, and they do that according to the charter with which we are held accountable for. So there is absolutely, I don't have a say at all, if that's what you're asking, as to what should air at what, even down to the time slot.
So when we say that's an independent process, are we talking to the level of having Chinese walls between them, or how does this work in practice?
There is without going into the minutiae of this, but obviously it's a different operating model than the commercial broadcasters, where I can't speak for them, but I assume there'd be much more coordination there. But we at SBS, as a public broadcaster, have this independence, editorial independence, as well as the independence internally, where commissioning editors as well as acquisition staff would make or buy content based on the charter being the guiding star, if you like. And Andrew and his team kind of gets given this and says, that's what you've got, go off and do it. So that's a bit simplistic, but that's effectively how it works.
Mm-hmm. So for a program like Go Back Where You Came From, you'd look at something like that, which been commissioned obviously for other reasons. How would you look at selling a program like that, or who would you sell that to? Or what sort of advertising would go with that?
It depends on a number of factors, I suppose, Senator, but ultimately we may not proactively go out and sell that to a specific client. It may well be the fact that there are, as they call it, spots and dots that fall in a schedule. So a range of advertisers, and remember that we are a truly national broadcaster, so metro and regional as well. So you could see multiple advertisers in the same 30-second spot throughout various regions. So it's fair to say that we don't necessarily go down to targeting specific advertisers in terms of sponsorship opportunities for a wide range of our charter shows because of the nature of the content.
So one of the issues that was raised before by Free TV is the capacity for you to regulate how much revenue you get. So if you're suddenly shooting the lights out on revenue, and it looks like your budget is going to be exceeded. Let's say the first year you're expecting 4 million, and with all these changes you're looking to make 12 million or 15 million or 20 million, right? Is there a capacity for the SBS to therefore then modulate what they're doing to sort of cut back so that they then just meet the budget constraint that's been set, or the budget target that's been set, the revenue target, as opposed to just saying, well, there's nothing we can do about this because next month or the next year may be a worse advertising year, so we're going to sit here on mounting revenue of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 million. Because in effect, Free TV is saying you have no capacity to constrain your behaviour to meet a set revenue target.
Probably need some more clarity on the question. Sorry, Senator.
We have absolute operational control over our costs and our revenues to the extent that they're controllable. I mean, to your point, the answer is yes. We would be able to control. It's much easier to earn less revenue than it is to earn more revenue, Senator, I guess is the answer to the question.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. My apologies for not asking you whether you were happy to be filmed, but given that you're on television cameras, I
Mr.
assume...
Mr. Khalil loves to be filmed.
Okay, thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that concludes today's hearing. Thank you very much for attending, and to everybody else in the room who also provided information and attended today. The committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.